Hello chess buddies, welcome to Amateur Chess University. Today, we'll be analyzing an interesting game that took place in a tournament in New Delhi 1990. This game was played between the teenage sensation Judit Polgar, who was only 14 at that time, and the Soviet-born Hungarian Grandmaster Alexander Chernin. It was a classic example of what an aggressive player Judit was, even as a teenager. So without further ado, let's head straight into the game. Alexander here had the white pieces and he begins with c4, going for the English opening. Judith replied with g6, going for the great snake variation. In the great snake variation, black tries to develop the dark square bishop, bring it to g7. Now Alexander pushed his d2 pawn to d4, going for the modern defense. Here Judith developed her kingside knight, bringing it to f6, going for the king's Indian defense. Bringing the knight to f6 is to prevent the pawn push from e2 to e4. So Alexander here developed his queenside knight, bringing it to c3, preparing to push the pawn to e4 next. And now Judith brought her dark square bishop g7, going for the normal variation of the king's Indian defense. And here Alexander played his pawn from e2 to e4. Now Alexander has all his pawns controlling the center. Here Judith pushed her pawn from d7 to d6, preventing the c4, the e4 pawn, from moving forward to the next square. Here Alexander pushed his pawn from h2 to h3, going for the Makaganov variation of the king's Indian defense. The Makaganov variation prevents the knight at f6 from coming to g4, while white looks to develop the dark square bishop, bringing it to e3. In this position, Judith goes for castling, and Alexander developed his kingside knight by bringing it to f3, preparing to push his pawn from e4 to e5. Judith was aware of this. She took the initiative. She pushed her e7 pawn to e5. Going for the pawn capturing, resulting in an open game, is not a good idea for white in this position because the king is still in the center. So Alexander pushed his pawn from d4 to d5. Now the pawn to d5 move blocks the c6 square for the knight at b8. So Judith developed her queenside knight by bringing it to a6. Now Alexander developed the dark square bishop, bringing it to e3, blocking the knight from coming to the c5 square and targeting this pawn at e4. Here Judith moved her knight from f6 to h5, preparing to push her pawn from f7 to f5. Here Alexander brought his knight back to h2, which was a bit of a passive move. Now Judith brought her queen from d8 to e8, and Alexander developed his light square bishop, bringing it to e2, launching a double attack on this knight at h5. Judith pushed her pawn from f7 to f5, targeting the e4 pawn, while also providing double protection to this knight through the g6 pawn as well as this queen at e8. Here Alexander captured the f5 pawn with the c4 pawn. Judith cannot immediately capture back this f5 pawn because her knight is still under double attack. So she first moved her knight from h5 to f4, now targeting the g2 pawn. Now Alexander went for the best option in this position, capturing the knight at f4 with the dark square bishop, and the e5 pawn captures the dark square bishop at f4, exposing the e file for its queen. And here Alexander made another mistake. The best option always when your king is in the center is to go for the castling, but he captured the pawn on g6. Now this allowed Judith to attack with her queen, capturing the pawn at g6, now targeting the g2 pawn. Alexander was on the defensive. He has to make a proper move, and the best move in this position was bringing his knight to f3, allowing the h3 pawn to be defended while also blocking the f4 pawn from moving forward. But here Alexander decided to give up castling. He moved his king to f1 to protect the g2 pawn. Now since the dark square bishop of white is eliminated, Judith brought her knight to c5. Here Alexander brought his non-active rook from a1 to c1, looking to bring his rook to c2. Judith blocks this by bringing her light square bishop to f5. And here Alexander moved his knight from h2 to f3, preparing to bring his knight to h4 next and targeting the light square bishop as well as the queen. Judith prevents this move by playing her dark square bishop to f6. The absolute best move for white in this position is to push the pawn from h3 to h4. This way, the rook at h1 will have more control along the h file, while also the dark square bishop will be prevented from coming to g5. But Alexander didn't do that. He moved his king to g1. Now Judith moved her king to h8, and Alexander continued to put his king in the harm's way, bringing it to h2. And now Judith brought her rook from f8 to g8, launching a double attack on this pawn at g2. Alexander brought his to g1. Now Judit moved her queen to h6, targeting this pawn in h3 twice. Here Alexander brought his light square bishop back to f1, providing an additional support for these two pawns. Now Judith moved her rook to g7. Best move for white probably in this position is to bring the knight to d4 next and trade it off with one of these monstrous bishops. But Alexander here pushed his pawn from b2 to b4, preferring to target this knight at c5. And Judith moved her knight back to d7. Now the rook at c1 is extremely ineffective because it cannot move to b1 or c2 due to this light square bishop. So Alexander looked to eliminate this problem by bringing his light square bishop to t3, asking for the light square bishop exchange. But this allowed Team Judith to play a spectacular move. So feel free to pause the video and try to find out this move played by Judit Polgar. If you are able to figure it out, well done. As you can see, the light square bishop has moved away from this f1 square. The g2 pawn is one different end down, and Judith took complete advantage of it, capturing this pawn at g2 with a rook. Now what can Alexander play? He cannot capture the rook with his king because then he will get checkmated in the next move. So after Judith sacrificed the rook, capturing the pawn on g2, Alexander captured the rook at g2 with his rook. The pawn at h3 is under attack from both the light square bishop as well as the queen. If queen captures the pawn h3, then Alexander will move his king to g1, and if Judith brings a rook to g8, then Alexander will go for the rook exchange. And now we will have the light square bishop exchange. And if you look at this position, white has two knights, a rook, the queen, while black has only a knight, queen, and the dark square bishop. So capturing the h3 pawn with the queen is not such a good idea. But capturing the h3 pawn with the light square bishop is definitely the best idea, and that is what Judith did. Now the light square bishop is targeting the rook at g2. Now Alexander has no way of saving this rook, because if he tries to bring his rook to g1, then Judith will play her light square bishop to f1, exposing the white king to a discovered check from her queen. Now the only option Alexander would be left with would be to play his knight to h4, and Judith will complete the checkmate by capturing the knight at h4 with her queen. So the best move for Alexander in this position would be to bring his king to g1, escaping from the discovered check, but he decided to bring his knight to e4, targeting this dark square bishop at e6. Here Judith brought her knight to e5, targeting the knight at f3. Here Alexander had no option but to capture the knight at e5, and the dark square bishop captures the knight at e5. Here Alexander brought his knight to g5, and it was a bad idea. Now Judith captured the rook at g2, and king captured the light square bishop at g2, and queen captured this knight at g5, delivering a check. Here Alexander moved his king to f3, and Judith brought a rook from a1 to g8, preparing to play g4 next. And now Alexander played his king to e2, and Judith pushed her pawn from f4 to f3, delivering a check. And it was in this position, after move 29, that Alexander Chernin resigned the game. There is not a lot of option left for white from here. Now the d2 and d3 squares are already blocked, and the king cannot move to f1 because Judith will deliver the checkmate in the next move. And moving to a1 will only temporarily stop the checkmate, but black is winning eventually. So that's the game. Then 14-year-old Judit Polgar absolutely destroyed the Soviet-born Hungarian Grandmaster Alexander Chernin with the black pieces, and it was a sign of great things to come for someone who will be regarded as the best chess female player of all times. If you have any thoughts on the game, feel free to share below. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.